the 10th gathering of ParlAmericas, Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality. Climate change poses a serious global threat that is increasingly being felt in many areas of the Americas and the Caribbean. All members of the population experience the impacts of climate change differently, but some groups, including women, are likely to experience compound levels of risk. These groups also tend to have unequal access to decision-making processes at all levels, which hinders their ability to contribute their knowledge and experience to climate-related planning, policy making, and implementation. ParlAmericas recently held its 10th gathering of the Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality under the rubric Gender-Responsive Climate Action. Parliamentarians can play a critical role in ensuring that their countries and legislators adopt a gender-responsive approach to climate action. This will help to ensure that entire populations are involved in and protected by efforts to understand and adapt to climate impacts. The Parliament channel sat down with the Honourable Robert Nault, MP Canada, Vice-President ParlAmericas. Why did ParlAmericas seek to intersect gender and climate action?
One of the issues, of course, of gender equality is the whole idea of making sure that in society, not just women, but members of society who may be disabled, members of society who are marginalized in some capacity, have an equal voice in dealing with climate change, which is a big issue of our generation. And in order to succeed in managing climate change, we're going to need all voices. In particular, women need to play a much larger role. And so we're working very hard with organizations around the world, when institutions like the United Nations, institutions that deal with climate change generally, and with individual states like Trinidad and Tobago, to make sure that we put in best practices, and part of the best practices has to be gender equality and voices of those other than just men in society.
What was the aim of holding this conference for parliamentarians in particular?
It gives us a chance to talk about best practices. We all learn from each other. In democracies like ours, we hear from other voices around the world. In island countries like Trinidad and Tobago, we learn a lot about the whole issue of flooding, the whole issue of hurricanes, things that maybe Canadians like myself would not hear. So we find out what those best practices are dealing with the oceans and how they affect us here as populations, and then we can take those best practices to countries like Canada and other countries around the world. So I think it's important for us to talk to each other because we certainly do learn a lot when we have these kinds of conferences.
How has response from countries been on a gendered response to climate action?
I think it's a sort of a new process for all of us. We did talk a little bit yesterday and the first day. We had a training session on gender financing and budgeting, and so that connects to climate change and the whole issue of if there are financial resources to climate change, how would gender and gender equality play a role in that? And my view of that is that because this is the beginnings of a long discussion, we've now had an opportunity to understand from a technical point of view with the experts that presented to the parliamentarians here just how we can make it work in our individual countries. And the success of ParlAmericas is only the success of the individual delegates who go back to their country. In this case, both the Speaker and the President of both houses were very active, and I think that'll make a big difference in making and putting forward solutions to those challenges that we all face.
What is next for ParlAmericas?
ParlAmericas is going to be having a major conference in Victoria in Canada, and we will be talking about sustainable populations, the whole issue of different groups. In my country, we have a very large indigenous population, over 600 First Nations that live in our region, and in that population there's a very large women's population, and so we're going to have some discussions about the issues dealing with minorities and how they might better be prepared to work with us.